You know that feeling when a story grabs you so hard you forget to blink? That's why we're here. This channel is for people who are hopelessly and helplessly addicted to a good story. Whatever you're in the mood for, we've got it. So pull up a chair, get comfortable, and welcome to your new addiction. This is Story Junkie, and trust me, you're going to want to stay. My brother Danny used to say that the thing about war is that it follows you home. He said it the way he said most things, quietly without drama, standing at the kitchen counter with a mug of coffee going cold in his hands and his eyes focused on something past the window that I never could quite see. Danny was 2 years younger than me and 10 years older in the ways that mattered. He'd been overseas twice before I went once, and when I came home from my third tour, lean and wired and unable to sleep past 4 in the morning, he was the only person who didn't look at me like something that needed to be fixed. "You'll find a way through," he told me then. "You always do." He was dead 6 weeks later. The official report called it a training accident, a weapons malfunction during a contracted security operation in a region I'd never heard of, working for a company I had to dig to find. The details were thin, thin in the way that things are thin when someone has worked to make them thin. I know that texture. I've operated in spaces where information gets curated into shapes that serve someone's purposes. I recognized it immediately, and the recognition sat in my chest like shrapnel. My name is Lana Costello. I did 11 years in the United States Army, 3 tours, a commendation I keep in a box in my closet and never look at. I can field strip a rifle in the dark. I can navigate by starlight. I can assess a threat, identify an exit, and make a decision under pressure in the time it takes most people to flinch. All of that, and I couldn't save my little brother. But I was going to find out who killed him, and when I did, they were going to wish I hadn't. The company was called Veridon Tactical Solutions. It had a website, clean, professional, with generic language of the private security industry and a registered address in Delaware, and beyond that, almost nothing. 3 levels deep in the corporate structure, it dissolved into holding companies and numbered entities and the particular architecture of invisibility that money builds when it doesn't want to be found. I spent 2 months digging before I found the name Trevor Black. He wasn't easy to find. That was, I understood immediately, entirely deliberate. Trevor Black didn't appear on Veridon's official documentation. He appeared in the negative space, the decisions that got made, the contracts that got awarded, the particular way that certain problems disappeared and certain obstacles ceased to exist. He was the gravity that bent everything around him without ever being visible. What I found, piece by piece, was this. Trevor Black had been running illegal arms through legitimate private security contracts for 7 years. The security operations were real enough to pass scrutiny, real enough to maintain the paperwork. But alongside the legitimate work ran a secondary current. Weapons diverted from procurement channels, sold to buyers in conflict regions who weren't supposed to have them, the profits layered through enough financial architecture to be effectively untraceable. Danny had been working a contract in one of those regions, and something had gone wrong, not a malfunction. I knew this because I found, through channels I won't describe, a partial communication, an encrypted message that had been partially recovered from a server that Veridon had thought was scrubbed. 3 lines, Danny's operator identifier. A reference to a discrepancy in a shipment and a response from an address I spent 3 more weeks tracing back to a procurement manager named Ruiz who reported directly to Trevor Black. The discrepancy Danny had found was a weapons cache that didn't match the manifest. He'd reported it, and 4 days later he was dead. I sat in my apartment with this information laid out on my kitchen table, and I thought about my brother standing at a counter with a mug of cold coffee, and I thought about the thing about war following you home. Then I started planning. Trevor Black lived officially in a penthouse in the financial district of a city I'll call my city, because I've earned the right to call it that. He had good security, professional, the kind that former military hires when they understand what former military can do. He had a social life that was curated like a portfolio, charity galas, gallery openings, the kind of visible philanthropy that builds a public image impervious to the private reality. He had a boat, a 54-foot motor yacht named, without apparent irony, Sovereign. He had a second property, a converted warehouse space in the Port District that wasn't registered to him at all, but that I'd identified through a combination of utility records, observed deliveries, and the particular foot traffic of men who move like they're paid to move. That warehouse was where the work happened. I spent 3 weeks watching it before I moved. I mapped the shift rotations. I identified the 4 regular security personnel and 2 rotating contractors. I found the delivery schedule, always Thursday evenings, always the same nondescript trucks, always with a lead time of precisely 40 minutes between arrival and departure. What I hadn't planned for was Detective Laura Bright. She found me first. That was the humbling part. I was on a rooftop across from the warehouse, a position I'd accessed from an adjacent building, clean entry, good sight lines, when I heard footsteps on the stairwell access I'd been watching. The door opened and a woman stepped out onto the rooftop. Late 30s, dark hair pulled back with the efficient economy of someone who didn't think about her hair much. Wearing the kind of practical clothes that suggest plainclothes law enforcement to anyone who knows how to read them. She wasn't drawing her weapon. She wasn't calling out an identification. She walked to the other side of the roof access structure and leaned against it and looked out at the same warehouse I'd been watching. Then she said without turning, "You've got better eyes than my surveillance team." I stayed where I was. "I don't know what you're talking about. You've been up here 4 times in 3 weeks. I got here first tonight." Now she turned. Her face was angular, unsmiling, with the kind of watchful dark eyes that took inventory constantly. "Detective Laura Bright. I've been building a case on Trevor Black for 14 months. A pause. "You want to tell me who you are?" I told her my name. Something in her expression shifted. A rapid internal calculation, the kind that happens when a piece of information lands in a context that already contains related pieces. "Costello," she said. "Daniel Costello's sister." "You know about Danny." "I know about everything that touches Trevor Black." She looked at me carefully. "I'm sorry about your brother. I mean that. The sincerity in it was not performed. I've been lied to by professionals on 3 continents, and I know what performed sincerity sounds like. This wasn't it." I held her gaze and recalibrated. "You've been building a case for 14 months, I said. "Why isn't he arrested?" Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Because the case keeps developing holes. Witnesses recant, evidence gets suppressed on procedural grounds. Twice I've been close enough to feel it, and twice something I couldn't account for closed the door." She looked back at the warehouse. "He has someone in the department. I don't know who. I can't go to my own chain of command without risking the whole investigation." I looked at the warehouse. The lights in the loading bay were on. "What do you need?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I need someone who can operate in spaces I can't. Someone who can get close enough to confirm what's in that warehouse without triggering an alert that gets traced back to a badge." She turned back to me. "And I think you need someone who can make sure that when this is done, it's done in a way that actually sticks, that actually puts him away." I thought about that. I thought about what I'd wanted in the rawness of the first weeks, which had been something unambiguous and final and not particularly concerned with courtrooms. And I thought about Danny, who had reported a discrepancy because it was the right thing to do, because he was the kind of man who believed in right things. "We do this together," I said. "My way on the ground, your way in the system." She put out her hand. "Agreed." Laura Bright was not an easy woman to work with. She was precise to the point of rigidity, with a set of procedural lines she would not cross, and a habit of explaining exactly why she wouldn't cross them in the measured cadence of someone who had made these arguments to herself many times before. She had principles, real ones, not the decorative kind. She also had, it turned out, a dry and entirely unexpected sense of humor that surfaced at the strangest moments. Crouched behind a dumpster at 2 in the morning in the Port District, she'd looked at me and said, "I pictured my career differently," with a deadpan delivery that had made me press my fist against my mouth to contain the sound. We were good together in the way that 2 very different instruments can make a coherent sound when they're playing the right notes. She knew the law, the bureaucracy, the pressure points of a properly constructed case. I knew the ground, how to move through it, how to read it, how to find what was hidden in it. She provided context, I provided access. What we built together over 6 weeks was the architecture of Trevor Black's undoing. The first piece was the warehouse. I went in on a Sunday night when the security rotation had its smallest overlap, a 14-minute window I'd confirmed over 3 weeks of observation. Laura was parked 2 blocks away with a direct line to a federal contact she trusted absolutely, a woman named Okafor who had been watching Black's financial movements for 2 years and had been waiting for ground-level confirmation. The warehouse interior was divided into thirds. The front third was exactly what its permits suggested, a storage facility for marine equipment, and convincingly so. The middle third was office space, unremarkable. The rear third was behind a reinforced door that required both a keypad and a biometric. I wasn't going through the door, I was going through the ventilation conduit above it, which was original to the building's 1960s construction and had never been updated. An oversight, the kind that happens when you're focused on the doors and not the ceiling. What was in the rear third confirmed everything. Weapons, not retail quantities, but serious, organized volume, crated and catalogued with the professional precision of someone who understood logistics. Alongside the physical inventory, a server bank, and on the nearest workstation left logged in by someone who'd stepped out with insufficient caution. An active interface showing shipment records. I had 11 minutes. I used a drive that Laura had provided, clean, forensically sound, the kind that produces evidence that can survive a chain of custody challenge, and I copied everything the workstation would give me. Then I photographed the physical inventory with a camera Laura had sourced through Okafor. Then I went back through the ceiling. I was back in Laura's car 13 minutes after I'd gone in. She looked at the drive in my hand and let out a breath that I understood was not the first one she'd been holding. "Is it enough?" I asked. "It's enough," she said. "It's more than enough." She called Okafor from the car. The conversation was brief and technical, and at the end of it, Laura sat with the phone in her lap and stared through the windshield at the quiet Port Street. "Warrants will be ready within 24 hours, she said. "Federal, multi-agency, the kind he can't make disappear." She paused. "And she's already moving on the internal leak. Someone in my department got flagged 2 hours ago based on metadata from a case file that was accessed in a pattern consistent with—" She stopped. "He was leaking my case timeline to Black's legal team for 18 months. The flatness of her voice when she said it told me exactly what that felt like. "I'm sorry," I said. "He'll face it," she said. "That's what matters." Trevor Black was arrested on a Wednesday morning. I wasn't supposed to know this in advance, but Laura had told me, not officially, not in any way that would appear in any record, but she'd looked at me on Tuesday evening and said, "Tomorrow morning, early," and that was enough. I was parked on the street outside his building when the federal vehicles arrived, 6 of them, unhurried, with the quiet authority of people who know that the man in the penthouse has nowhere to go. I watched the building's entrance. I watched the lobby lights. I watched, eventually, Trevor Black emerge through the glass doors in a shirt that was not tucked in, his silver hair uncombed, the public image cracked by the simple indignity of being taken before he was ready. He was flanked by federal agents. He wasn't resisting, he was performing composure. I could see it even from a distance, the held jaw, the deliberate pace, but his eyes were moving the way eyes move when a man is processing the collapse of something he believed was unassailable. I had imagined this moment differently. In the early weeks, it had been much less procedural in my imagination. If you made it this far, you already know you're a story junkie. Hit like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's feed that addiction together. A new story is always waiting for you here. But watching it happen, watching the cuffs and the vehicle and the door closing and the convoy moving away without drama, without spectacle, just the machinery of law doing its work, I felt something settle in me that I hadn't expected. It wasn't the sharp thing I'd been carrying for months, it was something older and quieter. Danny had reported a discrepancy. He'd done the right thing and it had cost him everything, and now the man responsible was in federal custody with enough evidence to put him away for the rest of his life. The right thing, eventually, had held. The trial lasted 9 weeks. Laura Bright testified for 3 days. She was precise, methodical, and entirely devastating. The kind of witness who doesn't raise her voice because she doesn't need to, because the facts, when properly arranged, are their own violence. I watched from the gallery as she walked the jury through 14 months of investigation, and I watched the jury's faces change as they understood the scope of what Trevor Black had built and the casualness with which he'd built it. The weapons charges were comprehensive, the fraud, the conspiracy, and, the count that mattered most to me, charges relating to the death of contracted personnel through the deliberate concealment of weapons irregularities. Danny's death was in that courtroom. His name was said aloud. The decision to silence him was put on the record, in the language of law, by people whose job it was to hold the record. I sat in that gallery and I let myself feel it. Trevor Black testified in his own defense on the 7th week. He was composed, articulate, dressed impeccably, the full performance of a man who had spent decades knowing exactly what he looked like and how to manage it. He was good. His lawyers had constructed a narrative that was technically coherent. It attributed everything to subordinates, to miscommunication, to the inherent complexity of global security operations. Then the prosecution put Ruiz on the stand. Cooper Ruiz, the procurement manager whose encrypted communication I'd traced back to Danny's report, had entered a plea agreement 3 months before the trial. He was the inside architecture of the operation, the man who translated Black's instructions into the precise decisions that moved weapons, falsified manifests, and on one specific occasion in one specific region authorized the removal of a problem. He spent 6 hours on the stand. I watched Trevor Black's composure fracture in real time, piece by piece. Over those 6 hours, the face he'd been wearing in that courtroom began to show the true structure beneath it. The stillness became rigidity. The composure became something more like suspension, a man holding himself in a shape that was costing him more and more to maintain. When the verdict came, I was holding Laura's number on my phone, but I didn't call it. I just sat in the gallery as the foreperson read the counts. And I thought about Danny at the kitchen counter with his coffee going cold, and I let the words land one by one. Guilty, 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 all of them. Laura found me outside the courthouse. She was still in her testimony suit, her badge clipped at her hip, and she had 2 cups of coffee from the cart around the corner, and she handed me one without asking if I wanted it. We stood on the courthouse steps and drank our coffee in the cold. Sentencing is in 6 weeks, she said. I know. Minimum 40 years, probably more. I know. We were quiet for a while. A wind came through between the buildings and she turned up the collar of her coat. Your situation, she said carefully. Some of what you did was... I know what it was. Okafor has been very specific about how the evidence was characterized in the warrant applications. The sourcing is clean, legally clean. She paused. You won't be charged. It's been made clear at a level above my pay grade that what you did is being classified as cooperative intelligence assistance. I looked at her. That's a creative classification. It is, she agreed. There was the dry deadpan again, quick and gone. I didn't write it. I looked out at the street. Cabs, pedestrians, the indifferent city moving through its Wednesday afternoon. Are you going to be all right? She asked. Not as a formality, as a real question. I thought about it honestly. The thing I'd been carrying for months had changed shape. Danny was still dead. That was a weight no verdict rearranged, but the man who had authorized his silence was going to spend the rest of his life inside a federal facility, and the weapons network he'd built was dismantled, and the record contained his name and his decisions and the truth of what he'd done. I think so, I said. Eventually. Laura nodded. She understood the eventually. She had her own weight. 18 months of work that had been leaked, a colleague who had betrayed her, the 2 occasions where she'd been close enough to feel it, and someone had closed the door. I could see it in the set of her shoulders, the careful economy of how she held herself. She was a woman who carried things properly, which meant she felt their full weight. What do you do now? She asked. I'd been thinking about that. I'd been thinking about the apartment where I'd spread Danny's case across my kitchen table and whether I could go back to it with the table cleared. I'd been thinking about what comes after the mission, after the objective, after the thing you've organized your entire existence around for the better part of a year is finally, irrevocably complete. I have a friend, I said. She runs a veterans advocacy organization. She's been asking me to come work with her for 2 years. I looked at my coffee. I think I'm going to call her back. Laura looked at me. Something in her face changed. Good, she said simply. We finished our coffee. The wind came through again. Below us, the city went on, being itself. Bright, I said as she turned to go. She stopped. You're a good cop, I said. Danny would have said the same. She was quiet for a moment. He sounds like he was a good man, she said. The best I ever knew. She nodded once. Then she walked back down the courthouse steps and disappeared into the crowd, precise and unhurried. A woman with more work to do and the Constitution to do it. I stood there a little longer. Somewhere in the city, Trevor Black was in a holding cell. Somewhere in a federal facility, the wheels of a long sentencing were beginning to turn. Somewhere in a box in my closet was a commendation I never looked at. And somewhere in a church in a town 2 hours from here was a grave I visited every month and would visit every month until I couldn't anymore. War follows you home. Danny knew that. I knew that. The trick, I was slowly learning, wasn't to outrun it. The trick was to make sure, when it followed you, that you were walking somewhere worth going. I finished my coffee, then took out my phone. I scrolled to a name I'd been passing over for 2 years. I pressed call. She answered on the second ring. Lana, she said, and the warmth in it was uncomplicated. I was wondering when you'd come home. I'm coming home, I said. And for the first time in a very long time, I meant it completely.